There are records that were never meant to be found, not because they were lost, not because the courthouse burned down, or the ink faded, or the pages crumbled with age, though all of those things happened too, in their own time. These records survived precisely because the people who kept them believed that the past, if buried deep enough, would stay buried. They were wrong. Somewhere in the hill country of Western Virginia, in a county whose name appears in very few history books, the birth records of every child born between 1841 and 1884, 43 consecutive years, share a single, identical detail. Not the same county, not the same attending physician, not the same family name. The same name appears in the line designated for witness to the birth. 43 years. Hundreds of children, one name. And nobody in that county, not a single soul who lived through those decades and survived long enough to speak of it, ever explained, not to their children, not to their pastors, not to the county clerk who first noticed it in 1889, who that person actually was. Before we continue with the story of Harlan County's most unsettling secret, if you're watching this for the first time, subscribe and drop a comment below telling us what state or city you're tuning in from. There are listeners in places we never expected, and we want to know where this story is finding you. Because this story, once you hear it, has a way of staying with you. To understand what those birth records meant and why their discovery sent a quiet kind of dread through every family that still had roots in that part of Virginia, you have to understand what life looked like in the hill country in the years following 1840. This was not the Virginia of grand plantation houses and rolling tobacco fields that most people picture when they hear the name. The western counties were a different world entirely. The mountains here were older looking somehow, as though they had been pressing down on the earth for longer than seemed possible, and the valleys between them were narrow and prone to shadow even at midday. The towns, if you could call them that, were collections of perhaps 200 or 300 souls at most, strung along creek beds and logging roads, their economies built on timber, on small family farms, and on the quiet, unspoken arrangements that governed life in isolated places. People in these communities didn't trust outsiders easily. They didn't trust county officials or circuit court judges or the men who arrived periodically from the more prosperous eastern counties to assess taxes on land whose boundaries nobody had ever formally surveyed. Trust in the hill country was a thing you earned over generations, and it was measured in small gestures. In whether a neighbor shared seed corn during a bad spring, in whether a man showed up when your barn needed raising without being asked. The county seat of what was then called Aldermore County, a name that itself disappeared from official Virginia maps following a redistricting effort in 1891, was a town called Greer's Mill. It had a courthouse, a general store, 2 churches of different Protestant denominations whose congregations maintained a polite and ancient rivalry, a smithy, a small hotel that doubled as a boarding house, and a population that fluctuated between 140 and 180 people depending on the season. The surrounding farmland was home to perhaps another 800 people scattered across the ridges and hollows. Families who might come into Greer's Mill 3 or 4 times a year for supplies, for court business, or for the irregular occasions when a traveling preacher came through and set up in the larger of the 2 churches. Births in these communities were rarely attended by physicians. There was no physician in Greer's Mill until 1857, and even after Dr. Alton Prewitt established his practice there, his reach extended perhaps 5 miles in any direction before the roads became too poor and the distances too great for a man on horseback to arrive in time to be useful. Most births were attended by midwives, experienced women whose knowledge had been passed down through families, whose hands had guided hundreds of children into the world, and whose presence at a birth was considered both practical and ceremonial. The birth record system in Aldermore County was itself informal by the standards of the eastern counties. A ledger book was kept at the courthouse, and births were supposed to be registered within 30 days of their occurrence. In practice, many were registered months later when a family member happened to pass through Greer's Mill. Some were never registered at all. The clerk who maintained the ledger, a man named Howard Cutter, who held the position from 1836 until his death in 1879, was known to be diligent about the records he did receive, filling in each entry in his careful, small handwriting. The child's name, the parents' names, the date of birth, the approximate location, the name of the attending midwife or physician, and the name of any witness present. It was in that final column, witness, that the anomaly lived. A.T.Y. Howard Cutter died on a Tuesday in March of 1879 at the age of 67 of what was recorded as inflammation of the lungs. He had been the county clerk for 43 years, having taken the position in 1836 when his predecessor, a man named Amos Veach, died after being thrown from a horse. Cutter was known throughout the county as a precise and methodical man, unremarkable in most ways, the kind of person whose absence is not fully felt until the machinery he operated begins to malfunction without him. His successor was a younger man named George Harwick, 29 years old and newly married, who had grown up in Greer's Mill and been appointed to the position by the County Board of Supervisors, largely because he was literate, punctual, and willing to work for the modest salary the county could afford to pay. Harwick spent his first weeks in the position familiarizing himself with the ledgers, the tax rolls, the deed books, the marriage records, the court dockets. It was routine work, and he approached it methodically, as Cutter had before him. He was not the kind of man who looked for trouble in old papers, but the birth ledger stopped him. He noticed it first on a cold morning in April 1879, about 6 weeks after taking the position. He had been cross-referencing birth records with the death ledger, a clerical task required by the county to maintain what passed for a census, when his eye caught the same name appearing twice in the witness column of entries from different years. He thought nothing of it initially. A midwife might reasonably appear dozens of times in such a ledger, but then he saw the name a third time, and a fourth. He began to go through the birth ledger systematically, starting from the earliest entries he could find. The ledger itself only went back to 1838. The records from before that year had either never been compiled or had been lost, depending on whom you asked. He worked forward through the decades year by year, page by page. The name appeared for the first time in a birth record dated April 14, 1841. The child was a boy named Thomas, born to a farming family named Dupree on a property described as lying along the northern fork of Spruce Creek. The witness listed was a woman. Her name was written in Howard Cutter's unmistakable small handwriting, Nora Vance. Harwick moved to the next year. Nora Vance appeared again. He moved to the year after that. Nora Vance. He continued. She appeared in 1845, in 1848, in 1851. She appeared in records from the northern end of the county and from the southern end, which were separated by nearly 30 miles of rough terrain. She appeared in winter and in summer. She appeared in years when the county had a practicing midwife on record, and in years when it did not. By the time George Harwick had worked through to 1879, the year of his appointment, the year Howard Cutter died, he had found the name Nora Vance as listed witness in 67 birth records. 67 children, spanning 38 years. He closed the ledger and sat for a long moment in the cold courthouse office, the smell of old paper and tallow candles around him, listening to the sound of the creak behind the building. Then he opened it again and checked his count. He had not made an error. What Harwick did next was the most natural thing in the world. He asked around. He asked the older men who came into the courthouse on business whether they knew a woman named Nora Vance. He asked the women who came to register deeds or pay taxes. He asked Howard Cutter's widow, a quiet woman named Martha, when she came to collect her late husband's outstanding wages. He asked the two churchmen, Reverend Delbert Sapp of the Methodist congregation and Reverend O.P. Newland of the Calvary Baptist, whether the name was known to them. The responses he received were, in retrospect, more interesting than the question itself. Most people said they didn't know the name, said it plainly, without hesitation. the way you deny knowing someone you genuinely don't know. But Harwick was a careful observer of people, as men who work with documents often are, and he noticed that the questions sometimes produced a small, involuntary reaction before the denial. A stillness around the eyes, a slight pause before speaking, the way a person looks when they are deciding something rather than simply answering. Martha Cutter, the late clerk's widow, was the most forthcoming. She was a woman in her mid-60s by this point, with the particular directness that comes from having outlived most of the circumstances that might have required caution. She told Harwick that she had heard the name once, perhaps 20 years prior, in connection with her husband. She had been sitting in the kitchen of their home while Howard was talking with a man at the back door. She could not see the man from where she sat, and she had heard her husband say, in a tone she could not quite characterize, "You tell Nora Vance that this has to stop." She had asked her husband about it afterward. He had said it was county business, and he had never mentioned the name again. Harwick wrote this down in his personal journal, a document that would not surface for another decade, and continued his inquiries. The answers he received from the older farming families were collectively more suggestive than any single response. Several people acknowledged, with varying degrees of reluctance, that the name Vance was associated with a family that had lived in the most remote part of the county, far up one of the eastern hollows, away from the main roads. They spoke of this family the way people speak of something they have long ago decided not to think about. Not with fear exactly, but with a kind of practiced avoidance that had become so habitual, it no longer felt like avoidance at all. One man, an elderly farmer named Rufus Dent, who was at that time in his late 70s and who seemed to have reached the age at which consequences no longer held much weight, told Harwick something more specific. He said that when he was a boy, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, which would have placed the memory sometime around 1813 or 1814, nearly 70 years before the conversation, there had been a woman who came down from the eastern hollows to attend births throughout the county. He did not know her family name as a child. She was called simply the Vance woman, or sometimes the woman from the hollow. She was not a midwife in the usual sense. She had never apprenticed with anyone, had no formal knowledge that anyone could point to, but she was sought out, particularly for difficult births, because her presence was considered to ensure a good outcome. Not in a religious sense, Dent clarified. Not the way you'd call for a preacher, in a practical sense. Women who were attended by her were said to recover more quickly. Children born with her present were said to be stronger. He had seen her once as a boy, he said. She had come to his family's farm when his mother was in labor with what would become his youngest sister. He remembered a woman of indeterminate age. He had perceived her as old at the time, but he acknowledged that as a child he had perceived most adults as old, with dark eyes and an unhurried manner and hands that he had found even at 12, somehow deeply unsettling, without being able to say exactly why. His mother had recovered. His sister had survived. He had not seen the woman again after that. Harwick asked him how old she had appeared to be. Dent thought about it for a long moment. 40 perhaps, he said finally. Maybe 50. It's hard to say. She looked the same age the second time I saw her, and that was 30 years later. Harwick paused his writing. He looked up from his journal. You said you saw her only once, he said. Dent met his eyes without expression. I was wrong about that, he said. George Harwick was not, by nature, a man given to superstition. He had been educated at a small academy in the eastern part of the state, had read his share of Enlightenment philosophy, and believed in the practical, unsentimental way of men who work with documents and numbers, that most apparent mysteries had explanations rooted in human behavior, in deception, in coincidence, in the ordinary failures of memory and record-keeping. But the longer he spent with the birth ledger, the more difficult it became to maintain that posture. The records themselves were the problem. Howard Cutter had been methodical, and the entries reflected that. The handwriting in the witness column was consistent over the decades, showing only the slight deterioration that came with age. The name Nora Vance was not, in most of the entries, an unusual or prominent detail. It appeared as one piece of information among several, written in the same careful hand as the names of the parents and the dates of the births. This was not a name that someone had added later, inserted to create an effect. It was simply there, embedded in the fabric of the records as naturally as any other detail. More troubling was the geography. Harwick had, over the weeks following his initial discovery, begun plotting the locations of the recorded births on a rough map of the county that he kept pinned to the courthouse wall. The properties described in the records were scattered across a vast area, from the creek bottoms near Greer's Mill to the high farms along the ridge roads, from the northern boundary of the county near the settlement called Bone Lick to the remote southeastern hollows where the last of the old-growth timber still stood. Many of these locations were separated by distances that would have required, in the road conditions of the 1840s and 1850s, a full day's hard travel on horseback. The records showed, on more than 20 occasions, births attended by Nora Vance that occurred within a week of each other in locations that were, by the roughest calculation, 15 to 25 miles apart. This was not impossible. A person could travel those distances. But a midwife would not travel that way. Not routinely, not across decades, not at the pace these records suggested. A midwife's territory was circumscribed by practical realities, by road conditions, by the physical demands of the work, by the simple fact that a woman in labor could not always wait for someone to arrive from 20 miles away. A midwife, in other words, stayed close to where she was needed. Nora Vance, if the records were accurate, appeared to be everywhere at once. Harwick brought this observation to Dr. Alton Prewitt, who had been the county's only practicing physician since 1857. Prewitt was in his late 50s by this point, a cautious, deliberate man who had arrived in Greer's Mill from Ohio and had spent 20 years developing, with considerable effort, the trust of a community that was not naturally inclined to trust physicians. He listened to Harwick's account with the careful attention of a man who knows that what he says next will be repeated. "You're describing a situation that requires explanation," he said finally. "That's what I've been doing for 6 weeks," Harwick told him. "Then let me suggest 2 possibilities," Prewitt said. "The first is that there is more than one woman named Nora Vance. A name can persist in a family across generations. A daughter takes her mother's name or is called by it. I considered that," Harwick said. "The handwriting is consistent. Cutter was recording one name, one woman, over 38 years. That doesn't mean it was one woman," Prewitt said. "It means Cutter believed it was one woman, or was told it was one woman." Harwick was quiet for a moment. "What's the second possibility?" he asked. Prewitt looked at him steadily. "That Howard Cutter knew exactly what he was doing," he said, "and that whatever arrangement he had with the Vance family was the kind of arrangement that is made once, kept carefully, and never discussed. This possibility, that Cutter's meticulous record-keeping was not incidental but deliberate, that the name appearing in the ledger was not an artifact of honest clerical work, but a constructed and purposeful trail, had not fully occurred to Harwick until that moment. He thought of Martha Cutter's account of her husband at the back door, speaking to a man he could not see. "You tell Nora Vance that this has to stop." Whatever that conversation had been about, it had taken place sometime around 1858 or 1859, more than 20 years before Cutter's death. And the name had continued to appear in the records for another 20 years after that. Whatever it was that Cutter had wanted to stop, it had not stopped. It was in the late summer of 1880, more than a year after his initial discovery, that George Harwick found the first piece of evidence that changed the nature of the investigation entirely. He had been corresponding with the county clerk of an adjacent county, a man named Peel, on routine administrative matters, and had mentioned, in passing, the anomaly in the birth records. He had not been certain why he mentioned it. Professional habit, perhaps, or the need that comes from sitting too long with an unanswered question. Peel's response arrived 3 weeks later, written in a hand that seemed, to Harwick, slightly less steady than Peel's usual correspondence. He wrote that he had, upon receiving Harwick's letter, checked his own county's birth records as a point of comparison. The name Nora Vance appeared in those records too, not as frequently, 6 times between 1843 and 1867, but it was there. In the same position, the witness column in the same form. Peel added one detail that Harwick found himself reading twice. 2 of the 6 entries in the adjacent county's records were from properties described as lying on the far western edge of that county, which was to say, on the opposite side of the mountain ridge from Aldermore County's eastern hollows. The same hollows where the Vance family was said to have lived. Harwick wrote back immediately, asking whether Peel knew anything of the family's history. 3 weeks passed. A month. Harwick wrote again. He did not receive a reply. He wrote a 3rd time in October of 1880, and the letter was returned to him unopened, stamped with the notation that the addressee was no longer at the listed address. Harwick made inquiries. What he learned was that Peel had resigned his position abruptly in September of 1880 and had moved his family to the city of Wheeling in the northern panhandle of the state, leaving behind no forwarding address and offering no explanation to the county board that he served. Those who had known Peel described him as having become, in the weeks before his departure, anxious and preoccupied, prone to interrupting conversations to look toward doorways or windows. His wife had told a neighbor that he was not sleeping. Harwick never established contact with Peel again. What he did establish, through a combination of correspondence with clerks in 3 other surrounding counties and 2 days of searching through archived territorial records at the state capital, was that the name Nora Vance appeared, with varying frequency, in the birth records of at least 4 counties across a geographic range of roughly 60 miles. The earliest appearance he could find was in a record from 1829, 51 years before the day he sat at his desk in the Greers Mill courthouse staring at that figure. In the spring of 1881, George Harwick did something that, in retrospect, he would describe in his journal as the most consequential decision of his adult life. He went to the Eastern Hollow. He went alone on a Saturday, telling no one where he was going. He had asked enough questions by that point to have established approximately where the Vance family property lay, far up along a tributary of the Spruce Creek, past the point where the maintained road ended and the track became a path of packed earth and exposed root. He had been told by one of the older farmers who had eventually become willing to speak about the subject that there was a house up there. Had been a house, at least, as of 20 or 30 years prior. Whether it was still inhabited, the farmer could not say. He rode for most of the morning, the path becoming progressively less defined as he climbed, the forest closing overhead in a way that turned the late April light green and diffuse. The sound of the creek below him, a constant low presence that seemed to get no closer, no matter how far he traveled. The air at that altitude had a smell that he would later try several times to describe accurately in his journal, and never fully succeed. Something like old wood and cold water and something else, something slightly sharp, like the air before a storm, except that the sky, in the fragments he could see through the canopy, was perfectly clear. He found the house in the early afternoon. It was smaller than he had expected, a 2-room cabin of hewn timber, old enough that the wood had gone almost black with age, set back from the path in a flat clearing that someone had, at some point, deliberately leveled out of the hillside. There was a kitchen garden in the rear, recently turned, a woodpile neatly stacked beside the south wall, smoke from the chimney, thin and pale in the bright spring air. Someone was home. He dismounted and stood for a moment at the edge of the clearing, aware of how quiet it was. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of attention, the particular quality of stillness that you feel when you know you are being watched. He had experienced that feeling before in legal situations when the counterparty knew more than they were showing. He recognized it here. He called out. He announced himself as the county clerk of Aldermore County, said that he was there on official business, and asked whether anyone was present. After a moment, the door of the cabin opened. The woman who appeared in the doorway was not what he had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. She was not old, or rather she did not appear old. She was perhaps 40 years of age, perhaps a few years more, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that were neither hostile nor welcoming. She stood in the doorway with the quality of someone who has decided, before answering the door, exactly how much of themselves they intend to reveal. "Mr. Harwick," she said. He had not told her his name. He would remember this for the rest of his life, that she had said his name before he said hers. "You know who I am," he said. "Word travels," she said simply. "You've been asking questions about me for a year." He was silent for a moment, recalibrating. "Then you know what I want to ask," he said. She regarded him with that same careful, measured quality. "Come in," she said. "I'll put water on." What happened inside that cabin on that April afternoon in 1881 is recorded in Harwick's private journal in some detail, though the journal itself was not discovered until 1913, when it turned up in a box of miscellaneous papers purchased at an estate auction in Greenbrier County, and did not come to the attention of any historical researcher until the early 1940s. The woman in the cabin told Harwick her name was Nora. She did not volunteer a family name, and he did not press, having learned by then that there were things in that county that became more opaque the harder you pushed on them. She was not what the older residents' accounts had suggested. She was not mysterious or evasive in the way that Harwick had, perhaps unconsciously, been anticipating. She was practical. She answered his questions directly, which was, in its own way, more unsettling than if she had been cagey. She told him that the Vance name in the birth records was correct, that it had always referred to one woman, that the woman had not always been her. She explained what she meant with a patience that suggested she had explained it before, to people who had asked, as Harwick was asking, from a position of confusion that she had long since moved past. The Vance name, she said, was not a family name in the conventional sense. It was something closer to a title, or a role. There had always been a Vance in that hollow, and the role of the Vance, as she put it without apparent self-consciousness, was to attend births throughout the region. "Why?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Because someone has to know," she said. He asked what that meant. What was it that had to be known? She looked at him with the expression of a person deciding how much trust is warranted. "The record that Mr. Cutter kept," she said finally, "was not the only record. Section 9. The other ledger. This was the center of it. This was the thing that George Harwick had been circling for 18 months without knowing it. The Vance women had kept their own records. Had kept them, by the account that the woman in the hollow gave to Harwick that afternoon, for as far back as anyone in the family could trace. Which was to say, further back than the county's official records went, further back than the courthouse ledgers, further back than the earliest territorial surveys. What kind of records? Birth records, she said, but not the kind the county kept. The county recorded names, dates, locations. The Vance records recorded something different. They recorded what she called conditions, a word that in the context of the conversation, as Harwick later set it down, seemed to mean something more than the physical state of the mother or the health of the child. The conditions of the birth in a broader sense. Who was present? What was said? What debts existed between families, and how those debts bore on the circumstances of the birth. Who the father was, in cases where the official record named someone other than the biological father. Who the child resembled. Harwick wrote in his journal that he sat with this for a long moment before responding. Then he asked, "Why would someone keep records like that?" The woman looked at him with something that might have been, in another context, amusement. "Why do you keep records?" she said. He said, "Because the county requires it. Because the law depends on accurate documentation of births and deaths and property transfers." "Yes," she said, "and these records serve a similar function." He asked her to explain. She said, There are things that happen in communities that the official records do not capture. Arrangements that are made between families, agreements that are honored or broken, obligations that pass from one generation to the next without ever being written down in the courthouse ledger. The kind of things that determine who inherits land, who owes a debt, who has a claim on whom. In a place like this, in a county like this, those undocumented arrangements were not minor details. They were the actual architecture of how people lived. The Vance records, she said, were an accounting of that architecture. Harwick asked the obvious question. He asked why the official county records bore the Vance name as witness. Why had Howard Cutter, for nearly 40 years, been writing that name in the ledger? She was quiet for a moment. The fire in the hearth made a sound. The thin thread of smoke rose from the chimney outside. Because he was one of the people who needed things not to be in the official record, she said. This was the claim that Harwick found most difficult to absorb and which he spent the most time examining in the pages of his journal. Howard Cutter had been county clerk for 43 years. He was known as a meticulous and honest man. His official record was, by all accounts, clean. The ledgers he kept were accurate and carefully maintained, and there was no suggestion, in any account that Harwick had gathered, that Cutter had engaged in any of the corruption that was common in rural county governance of that era. No sale of favorable assessments, no manipulation of land records, no embezzlement of tax revenues. But the woman in the hollow made a different kind of claim. She did not say that Cutter was corrupt. She said that Cutter was careful, that the relationship between Cutter and the Vance family had been, from his perspective, a form of insurance. By recording the Vance name in the birth ledger, he was acknowledging in an oblique and deniable way that the Vance women existed and that their records existed. This acknowledgement served, in the logic of the arrangement, as a kind of guarantee, a signal to anyone who knew how to read it, that the official records and the Vance records were in alignment, that nothing in the courthouse ledger contradicted what the hollow ledger contained. Why would a county clerk want such a guarantee? Because, she said, Howard Cutter had a secret that the Vance records documented. She did not tell Harwick what the secret was. She said only that it was the kind of secret that required the official record to be maintained with particular care, and that Cutter had understood, from very early in his tenure, that the best protection for a man who needed official records to be trusted was to be himself genuinely trustworthy. Harwick asked, was this secret something that could harm people who were still living? She considered this for a long moment. It's already harmed some of them, she said quietly. The ones who are still living chose to keep it. He asked who they were. She did not answer. He asked a different question. He asked how many families in the county had entries in the Vance ledger that differed in significant ways from what the official record contained. She looked at him steadily. Enough, she said, that you should think carefully about what you do with the question. George Harwick rode back down from the hollow in the late afternoon, the sun slanting through the trees and throwing long shadows across the path. He did not look back. He had the distinct sense, which he recorded in his journal with a precision that suggests he was trying to fix it accurately even as he experienced it, that the clearing behind him had become empty the moment he turned away from it. He did not go to the hollow again. What he did over the following months was more cautious and, in its way, more revealing than a second visit might have been. He paid close attention to the community around him. He watched, specifically, for evidence of what he had been told, for signs in the behavior of the older families, of the kind of undocumented architecture that the woman in the hollow had described. He found it, not in dramatic form, not in accusations or confrontations or anything that would have been visible to a casual observer. He found it in the small, unremarkable transactions that constitute the daily life of a rural community, in the way certain families treated certain other families, in which land disputes were pursued aggressively and which were allowed to quietly resolve, in whose credit at the general store was honored without question and whose was scrutinized. He found it in silences, in the specific, almost tangible quality of quiet that came over a room when certain subjects were approached, the way conversation would redirect itself around particular names or particular years, with the practiced ease of water moving around an obstacle it has learned to avoid. He had been living in this community for 2 years. He had thought he was learning it. He understood now that he had been reading the official version of it, the surface record, while the actual ledger existed somewhere else entirely. In September of 1881, he received an unexpected visitor at the courthouse. The man gave his name as Dyer. He offered no first name, and Harwick did not ask. He was perhaps 60 years old, a farmer by his appearance, a man of the county by his manner. He said he had heard that the new clerk had been asking questions about old records. Harwick said yes, that was accurate. The man said he wanted to offer some advice. He said, "There are records in this county that have been kept a certain way for a long time. The people who kept them that way had reasons. Some of those reasons are still operating." Harwick asked what he meant. The man looked at him with an expression that was not hostile. It was, Harwick wrote later, almost kind. The expression of a person who is delivering a warning because they have decided that the warning is genuinely warranted. "There are people in this county," the man said, "who have built their lives on the assumption that certain things are settled. Land, names, family lines. If the records you're looking at suggest that those things aren't settled the way people believe they are, it would be better for a lot of people if that stayed as a private question." Harwick said, "Are you suggesting I stop my inquiry?" "I'm suggesting," the man said carefully, "that you think about what the inquiry is for. If it's for the county, to improve the records, there's nothing in those records that affects the county now. The people those records belong to are mostly dead or gone." He paused. "And if it's for something else," he said, "then I'd suggest you think about who else might be asking the same question." He left without being asked to stay. Harwick sat in the empty courthouse for a long time after, listening to the sound of the creek. 2 weeks later, someone broke into the courthouse during a night when Harwick was not present. Nothing was taken. The only disturbance was in the storage room where the older ledgers were kept. The books had been moved, not damaged, rearranged as if someone had been looking for something. The birth ledger was in its place. Harwick checked it carefully. Nothing had been removed. But 3 pages near the back of the ledger, covering records from the late 1870s, had been partially erased. The witness column scraped with a knife and rewritten in a hand that was close to Howard Cutter's, but not identical. The name that had been written in those 3 entries was not Nora Vance. It was simply unknown. Harwick spent the winter of 1881 and into the spring of 1882 in a state that he described in his journal as one of suspended decision. He had information, fragmentary, second-hand, partially verified, that suggested the official record of the county's history was a carefully maintained fiction built over a structure of private knowledge. He could not prove this. He could not name names. He could not produce the document, the Vance ledger, that would have made the matter concrete. He could also not unhear what the woman in the hollow had told him. In April of 1882 he received a letter. It bore no return address and had been left, not mailed, in the courthouse mail slot, which meant that whoever wrote it had come to Greer's Mill and delivered it by hand. The letter was brief. It read, in its entirety, "There are 47 entries in the county birth record bearing the Vance name that do not match the Vance ledger. Of those 47, 11 concern children whose recorded parentage is incorrect. Of those 11, 4 concern families that still hold significant property in this county. The names of those families are known to you. If you know which 4 I mean, you understand why no further communication on this subject is possible. Burn this letter." Harwick did not burn it. He kept it, folded inside the back cover of his journal, where it remained for 30 years, until the journal itself was sold at auction. He did not act on it. He did not act on it, he wrote, because he understood the situation with a clarity that had taken him nearly 3 years to achieve. The Vance records were not a weapon and had never been intended as one. They were, as the woman had said, an accounting, a parallel record of the true structure of the community, maintained not for the purpose of exposure, but for the purpose of stability. The person who had written that letter was not trying to provoke him into action. They were telling him exactly enough to ensure that he understood what he was dealing with. The 4 families whose parentage records were incorrect were almost certainly the 4 families whose land holdings and community standing depended, in ways that a careful examination of deed records and inheritance lines would reveal, on the official birth record remaining unquestioned. To expose the discrepancy would not merely embarrass those families. It would unravel a set of property rights and social arrangements that had been operating unchallenged for decades. The legal consequences alone would have been catastrophic. The human consequences, in a county where property disputes had, within living memory, ended in violence, did not bear thinking about. Harwick made his decision. He decided to do nothing. He continued in his position as county clerk for another 11 years until 1893, when Aldermore County was redistricted out of existence and its records were absorbed into the newly constituted county that replaced it. He was known throughout his tenure as a reliable and conscientious official. The birth ledger was transferred, along with all other county records, to the new county courthouse. The erased pages remained as they were. He never went back to the Eastern Hollow. He never tried to contact the woman again. He never tried to find the Vance ledger. In the final entry of his journal, written in 1913 and dated simply March, he wrote, "I do not know if she is still there. I do not know if there is still a Vance in that hollow, keeping the other record. I do not know, and I have made my peace with not knowing. A man in my position handles documents. What those documents represent and what they conceal, what they protect, what they would destroy if they were read differently, is not always a thing a county clerk is meant to understand. Howard Cutter understood this. I understood it later than he did. Perhaps that is the difference between a man who spends 40 years in a place and one who spends only 14. But there is one thing I know, that I have always known. From the moment she said my name in that doorway before I had spoken a word, she was not surprised to see me. She had been waiting. And I have spent 30 years wondering what she was waiting for, and whether whatever it was ever arrived. The Harwick Journal surfaced publicly in 1943, when a historian named Cecil Abbott at a small college in the Shenandoah Valley published an account of it in a regional academic journal. Abbott had come across the journal as part of a larger project researching pre-Civil War administrative records in the Virginia mountain counties, and the Vance anomaly, which he called it in his article, occupied about 4 pages of a 22-page paper on clerical record-keeping practices. His article attracted almost no attention at the time. The country was at war. Academic papers on 19th-century county administration were not widely read in any period. But Abbott had done something that Harwick had not. He had tried in a limited way to locate the Vance ledger. He had not found it. What he had found, and recorded in 4 additional pages that he ultimately did not include in the published article, and which came to light only when his own papers were donated to the college archive in 1971, was a pattern of absence that he found more significant than any presence could have been. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, following the redistricting of Aldermore County, several legal proceedings had taken place in the new county courthouse that bore, in Abbott's reading, the unmistakable marks of the kind of property dispute that would result from the correction of an incorrect birth record. None of these proceedings mentioned Vance or the birth ledger or anything that could be directly connected to the situation Harwick had described. But they were there. Quiet, unremarkable court actions, settled out of the public record, with a swiftness that suggested private agreement rather than legal resolution. Abbott wrote, in his unpublished notes, "The most interesting aspect of these proceedings is not their outcome, which in each case favored the established holder of the property in question, but their timing. They cluster in the years 1887, 1893, precisely the period during which the redistricting would have brought new eyes to old records. Someone with knowledge of the birth ledger anomaly was, in these years, systematically protecting the families in question from legal challenge. That person had to have access to both the official records and the Vance records. That person, or the family of that person, is still in this county. He did not name who he believed that person to be. His notes did not go further. When asked, in a letter from a colleague in 1952, whether he had pursued the matter after the war, Abbott wrote back a single paragraph. I had occasion to visit the county in 1948 while researching a separate project. I made inquiries about a Vance family in the Eastern Hill Country. I was told, by 3 separate individuals, and with a uniformity that suggested coordination, that no Vance family had ever lived in that area, and that the name did not appear in any local record. I thought about what Harwick had written, that the woman knew his name before he spoke it, and that she had been waiting. I did not go up the hollow. I think that was the correct decision. What remained in the end was what always remains in cases like this. Not evidence, but shape. The shape of a secret, pressed into the available record, like the impression of a leaf in old stone. The birth ledger from Aldermore County, the original document bearing Howard Cutter's handwriting and the 67 entries marked with the name Nora Vance, was transferred to the State Archives during a records consolidation project in the 1920s. It can be examined today, or could be examined, when the archive was last known to be accessible in the mid-20th century, before the relevant section was moved to off-site storage, pending a renovation that, if the available information is accurate, was never completed. The Vance ledger, the other record, the private accounting of the actual architecture of the county's family life, has never been found. No historian, no legal researcher, no journalist who has followed the trail of the Harwick Journal has located a document matching its description. This is, depending on your disposition, either evidence that it never existed or evidence that it was very well hidden. The 4 families referenced in the anonymous letter to Harwick, the families whose property holdings depended on an incorrect birth record, were never definitively identified. Abbott believed he knew 2 of them. His unpublished notes named 2 surnames that he had identified through cross-referencing the property disputes of 1887 to 1893 with the birth records of the 1840s and 1850s. He did not publish these names. He did not explain, in any document he left behind, why he chose not to publish them. George Harwick died in 1921 at the age of 71, having spent the last 28 years of his life working in a hardware store in Louisburg. He never discussed the journal publicly. He never returned to Greer's Mill. He had 2 children, a son and a daughter, who survived him. Neither appears to have known about the journal. Howard Cutter's widow, Martha, died in 1893, a few months after the redistricting that erased Aldermore County from the official maps. She is buried in a cemetery in what is now the eastern edge of the county that replaced it. Her gravestone names her husband and his years of service as county clerk. It contains no other identifying information. The woman in the hollow, the woman who told George Harwick her name was Nora, who said the record that Mr. Cutter kept was not the only record, who knew his name before he spoke it, does not appear in any official record in any form, not in the birth ledger, not in the death records, not in the tax rolls of Aldermore County or any surrounding county, not in the census records of 1850, 1860, 1870, or 1880. She appears only in the birth records, in the witness column, in 67 entries spanning 38 years. And before that, in records from adjacent counties, going back to 1829. And if the Vance ledger exists, in whatever hidden place it has been kept since George Harwick declined to search for it, it contains the true version of this story. The names, the details, the debts and obligations and biological facts that the official record was built to conceal. It contains, presumably, the full accounting of what Howard Cutter wanted stopped and could not stop, and what it cost him to carry that knowledge for 40 years, writing the same name in the same careful hand, year after year after year. A record is only as honest as the person who keeps it, and some records, it turns out, are kept by more than one person. That has always been the unsettling part. Not the name that appeared 67 times, but the name that appeared nowhere at all, and knew everything anyway. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. See you in the next video.